Thank you, Brother William. Thanks for reading that quite a lengthy reading. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come and listen to what we have to say tonight. As you're probably aware, tonight we're going to have a look at how Italy, which is the country in Europe, plays a part in Bible prophecy, and therefore the historical events recorded in the Bible about Italy. So we've no doubt all heard about Italy. It's the home of Venice, it's the home of Milan, Florence, Naples, Amalfi, Cinque Terre, Lake Como, the Dolomites. The list goes on. We can all see it as an ideal holiday destination, and it certainly is a very popular destination. It's one of the most beautiful places you can visit, and it definitely is very popular. However, one thing I missed as part of the list of places within Italy is Rome. Rome is also very popular, and not just because of its tourist attractions, but also because of its religious importance and history. Within the reach of Rome at present day lies the Vatican, which is a country standing at the heart of the Catholic religion, which is supported by about 1.3 billion people worldwide. It's the heart of the Catholic religion because that's where Catholic Christianity has been set up, in St. Peter's Basilica, and it's now seen as the permanent seat of the Pope, who is the spokesperson for the whole Catholic Church. So our topic for tonight is basically about finding out what Italy has to do with the Bible. Christianity stemmed from the Bible, so how did it get from where it was, as recorded in the Bible, to where it is today? Things have certainly changed, and we'll have a bit of a look at the difference between Christianity in the Bible and Christianity today as part of our consideration tonight as well. But we'll get into that once we've established what Italy actually has to do with Bible prophecy. So if we start our search for Italy in the Bible just by conducting a simple search of the word Italy, we'd find that it occurs 5 times, and all of those occurrences are either on Paul's journeys in the New Testament or as part of a letter from Paul to the Hebrews toward the end of the New Testament. Now we could also do a search on Rome, which occurs a few more times with 15 occurrences, most of which again are part of Paul's journeys or letters. However, just searching for those phrases and those places isn't going to show us the in-depth prophecies and the stories about Rome and how it's connected to the Bible. This is why our topic tonight is about Italy in Bible history and Bible prophecy. Sure, Italy is mentioned a bit, but it's mostly spoken about in prophetical ways, meaning the place itself isn't specifically mentioned, but rather represented through certain prophecies in different places. And one prophecy we're going to spend most of our time on tonight is the prophecy spoken of in Daniel 2, which is why we chose that as our reading tonight. You may have heard of the events of Daniel 2 already. It's basically just King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which is also referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's image. We're going to have a bit of a look through Nebuchadnezzar's image, and this is important because this image, or dream dreamt by Nebuchadnezzar, is a picture for us of the progression of world powers from Nebuchadnezzar's time through to Rome and beyond. It's a picture that showed to Nebuchadnezzar back in his day that his kingdom was going to be overthrown by other world powers. Each of the different colours you see there on the screen, or medals, of the image represent different powers, and it showed to Nebuchadnezzar what was in store for his and his kingdoms, and indeed the world's future. Before we look at the powers this image represents, we'll first have a look at a bit of context behind Nebuchadnezzar dreaming this dream. We'll have a look at the story we read tonight. So we start in Daniel 2, as we read, with a fairly simple statement in verse 1. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed a dream. He was troubled, or as the original Hebrew means, he was agitated, and he woke up. It doesn't tell us what the dream was. It just says he dreamed a dream, no more than that. Now, he obviously noticed that there was something a little bit different about this dream, because his first step, or his next step, was to call all his magicians, all his astrologers, all his sorcerers to come and try and interpret the dream for him. Now, it was a normal thing in that time period for a king or an emperor to ask this question. Kings would often ask their advisors what their dreams meant, and some kings would use the information they gained from that to either justify their rule as king or to help them decide what to do in a certain battle. However, Nebuchadnezzar approached this one a little differently to usual. Usually he would tell the astrologers and the advisors what his dream was, and they would no doubt make something up about what it was that made them sound intelligent and somewhat believable. However, like we said, Nebuchadnezzar played his hand a little differently to usual this time. He obviously thought his dream was important for some reason, so rather than telling them the dream, he asked them to tell him what the dream was about so that they could interpret it. Obviously, when the advisors first spoke to him about his dream, they asked him to tell them what it was about so they could interpret it. But his immediate response was that no, he wanted them to tell him what the dream was so that he could be sure what he was hearing was right and the actual interpretation. And as you can imagine, because the advisors had absolutely no ability to correctly interpret his dreams, let alone read Nebuchadnezzar's mind, they were fairly stumped and essentially said, well, you need to tell us what you dreamed before we can tell you what it means. And then, as you can imagine, Nebuchadnezzar gets angry and says, look, you've all come here to try and trick me with your fake interpretations. I don't want to hear it. I just want to know what it actually means. And if you can't tell me, you're going to die, essentially. The advisors at this point were no doubt very delicately trying to explain that this was not possible, which is obvious in their response, where they're telling the king very carefully that there is no man in the world who can do this, and that no king ever before has asked this. Basically a long way of saying, no, we can't do this. Now Nebuchadnezzar got the point, and following through with his threat, he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon should be killed. Now Nebuchadnezzar's guards started the search for all the wise men, and this included Daniel and his friends. Now Daniel and his friends were captives from the land of Israel that had been brought up in Babylon to become wise men and advisors to the king. So as we read, there was a man named Arioch, who was the captain of the king's guard, and he went to Daniel's house under orders to kill him. And when he arrived, Daniel asked him why he was there. Now obviously Arioch told him that the king had sent out a decree that the wise men should be killed, and it's then that Daniel says, well, if you give me some time, I'll not only be able to tell you what the dream is, I'll be able to tell you what it means as well. So none of the so-called wise men that could tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream or interpret it, but Daniel could. And we see why this is in future verses. It's not Daniel doing the interpretation, it's God. God is the one who gave Daniel a vision or a dream at night that told him what the dream was and what the interpretation was. So Daniel requested that the king gives him time, and once he had some time to himself, he prayed to God, and God revealed the dream to him. And the chapter goes on to show how Daniel correctly told Nebuchadnezzar what he dreamed, and then went on to explain to him what the interpretation of the dream is, and we'll look at that in just a bit. So from that brief rundown of that story, we can come to a conclusion on a few things. Firstly, that the dream must have been sent by God. God was the only one who knew what the dream was and what the dream meant, so it must have been sent from him. We can also be comfortable saying that because the dream was given and interpreted by God, that the events prophesied in the interpretation of this dream are also true and will or already have come to pass. We'll see how some of it already has come to pass, and we can prove it, and also how that all relates to Italy or Rome, and then what the future fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's image actually is. So there's Nebuchadnezzar's image on the screen there. This is an impression of what it may have looked like. It's essentially taken from a mixture of what we know was interpreted in the dream and what we know from history as to what emperors or kings look like. It may have had Nebuchadnezzar's face itself on it, we don't know. All we're told from Daniel's interpretation from God is that the form thereof was formidable. Now, was terrible. Terrible there means formidable. It was a formidable image, and that then explains probably why Nebuchadnezzar actually woke up in the first place. It was essentially a nightmare, and as we'll see, the nightmare continues in the interpretation of the dream itself. So Daniel tells the king the dream first. He details the fact that the image was made up of a series of metals. It starts at the top, and as it goes down the image, the metals get lower and lower in value. So we start at the top with the head, which was made entirely of gold. The chest and arms were made of silver. The belly and thighs were made of brass. The legs were made of iron, and the feet were made partly of iron and partly of clay. That's the description of the formidable image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. So after Daniel had successfully told Nebuchadnezzar about this dream that he dreamed about, he went on to tell him that the rest of the dream had shown Nebuchadnezzar a stone that was cut out of the mountain, but without any visual input from anything around it, had proceeded to smash the image on its feet, which was the iron and clay part, and then proceeded to grind the entire image to powder, and then once it had done this, the stone grew to fill the earth. That was the whole dream. This is what Nebuchadnezzar had seen while he was asleep, and this is what Nebuchadnezzar wanted some answers on. To him, it may have appeared weirdly specific, and some things may have been quite close to home because it may have been an image of him. We don't know exactly, but something made Nebuchadnezzar really care and be invested in finding the answer to this dream. Now, the interpretation of the dream is the important part. The dream had been given to Nebuchadnezzar from God, and God wanted to convey a message. God was the only one who knew the interpretation because he had designed the dream, and therefore he knew what it meant. So let's have a look at the interpretation that God showed to Daniel. So the interpretation starts in verse 37 of Daniel 2. Daniel starts by recognizing Nebuchadnezzar's superiority and the strength of his current kingdom. However, he adds that in this kingdom and strength and glory and power, it was all given to him by God. He recognizes all this and then tells Nebuchadnezzar that he is the head of gold. His kingdom, his throne, his power are all represented in the head of gold. Starting from verse 39, Daniel goes on to tell Nebuchadnezzar how that after him and after his kingdom, there would be another kingdom which would be inferior to him. We can see the inferiority of that next kingdom represented in the fact that the metals used become less and less valuable as we move down the image. The head and shoulders are the chest and arms are made of silver, which is an inferior metal. So the kingdom after Nebuchadnezzar would be inferior to him. And we'll look at what that all means later. Now, after that kingdom, there would be another kingdom which is represented in the brass, in the belly and thighs of the image. And then the fourth kingdom, as Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, would be a kingdom of iron. Now, everyone knows that iron is a strong metal, and as part of the interpretation, Daniel informed the king that this fourth kingdom would be as strong as iron. So the metals of the image actually represent a specific characteristic of the kingdom that they correspond to. The final part of the image, the feet, where, like we saw, part iron and part clay. And Daniel interprets this as partly strong and partly broken. Basically, the kingdom would be divided. There's more to the dream than just that, but we'll circle around to the last part of the dream toward the end to see the result of everything and what happens to the image. So we have the entire image. It's all different metals, all representing different kingdoms or different forms of rulership following the current kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel said that these kingdoms would come after Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the kingdom of Babylon, or the head of gold, as the most superior part of the dream. We know that the kingdom of Babylon, or the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, did eventually come to an end. However, like we said, the metals of the image also correspond to a characteristic or a few characteristics of the specific kingdom that it corresponds to. For example, Babylon was known for its gold. In Isaiah 14 verse 4, it's referred to as a golden city. Now, if we do a bit of research using historical records other than the Bible, we can find a few other things as well. Firstly, in Babylon, there was a culture of God worship. that was very important to them and their way of life. So there was the chief god in Babylon, on the screen there, who was named Marduk. He was called the god of gold. Gold was also a huge part of their architecture as well. Gold was used extensively in all Babylon's buildings. They used them in their buildings, their shrines, even their walls were overlaid with gold. We know this because there was a Greek historian named Herodotus who visited Babylon 90 years after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and he recorded all of the wealth and the overwhelming amount of gold everywhere. So we can see from that Babylon was definitely a wealthy city, represented by gold in more ways than just one. Babylon was recognizable for its wealth and its connection to gold, so it made sense that it was represented as that head of gold. Now in Daniel 2, the interpretation continues with Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar that the kingdom of Babylon would be overthrown by a kingdom inferior to his. Now immediately we can see the first way that God represented this in the image, in the fact that the metal used is inferior to that of the metal used to represent Babylon. So gold versus silver. Silver is inferior to gold in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes because it's less valuable to him. We'll see how it was inferior in other ways in just a second as well. So the next power, it's known as Medo-Persia, or the Medes and the Persians. It's actually two powers sort of combined together to create one power in this instance. This is shown in the fact that the image has two arms. One arm is the Medes and one arm is the Persians, and they're joined together to create a chest, or one combined power. The way they're inferior to Babylon is because they were a partnership kingdom. They were not combined or one unified kingdom like Babylon was. They were by no means inferior to Babylon as a military power. They were purely inferior due to their lack of unity. We know they weren't militarily inferior, obviously, because they defeated Babylon in 539 BC. And we can see that from historical and biblical records, which is actually when Nebuchadnezzar's reign came to an end. Again, the metal represented an important part of Medo-Persia, which helps us to further confirm using history that this was the power referred to in the image. Back in ancient times, silver was used as the metal for currency, or the metal that they used to make money, and it was the standard of exchange. And Medo-Persia specifically was known for basing its power on money, as it was collected through an extensive tax system. We can see a biblical representation of this in Ezra 14 verse 4 and Daniel 11 verse 2, where the revenue of the kings is seen as important enough to stop the building of the walls by the people of Israel. And also in Daniel 11, the power of the kings is dictated by their individual riches. So Medo-Persia was heavily based on the idea of silver, as they relied on their money to keep their power. And it was in 539 BC, like we said, that the Medo-Persians overtook the Babylonian Empire. That was the downfall of King Nebuchadnezzar, and the power was then essentially transferred to the Medo-Persians. And that's when our timeline moves on to the chest and the arms of silver. However, the chest and the arms of silver also had an expiry date. The Medo-Persians grew in their wealth and their power under a king called Xerxes and began an invasion of Greece. Now this invasion or war lasted a very long time, and it wasn't until 334 BC that Alexander the Great, who was a Greek, defeated the Persian army. So there we see another defeat of one of the powers in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The next power to take over was the belly and the thighs represented in brass. Now Daniel in Daniel 2 adds an additional clause about this third power, and that is that they shall bear rule over all the earth. Now this power represented in the brass of the image would rule the earth. In those days when it said to rule the earth, it basically meant the entire world as they knew it then. So they hadn't discovered the entire world at this stage, so controlling the earth was controlling the then known world, which was true of Greece. Alexander the Great, as we know from historical events, was the one who overtook the Persians, or the chest and arms of silver. Now this third power, as we know, was made of brass. And as we've seen so far, the metals represent a distinguishing feature about that power that we can use to further prove that it was them. So we already know it was Greeks from historical records who overtook the Persians, but just to show some other factors that come into play, we can look at the metal specifically and how that relates to Greece. So it was brass that represented the Greek Empire, and during warfare, the Greeks generally favoured brass or bronze as the material of choice when creating all of their armour and their weaponry. Also, the majority of statues and images that have been discovered from the time of the Greeks are made entirely from brass. Another part of the brass section of the image that shows it's Greece is in the fact that it started as a belly and transformed into a pair of legs. So when Greece first took over Medo-Persia, it was led by Alexander the Great, so one person. And then after Alexander the Great died, Greece was ruled by his 4 emperors who, after some battling, merged themselves into 2 powers, which was Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria. And that's represented in the image by the splitting off of the 2 legs, or the 2 powers within the Grecian control of the world. After the belly and the thighs part of the image had had their turn, it was time for the legs of iron to take control. Now, everything we've seen so far is context for this part onwards. From here on, you'll see what all of this has to do with Italy and why we had to go through that image to understand how the rest of it works. So the legs of iron represent Rome. This is where we can see the Bible's involvement with Italy, or vice versa, Italy's involvement with the Bible. Now, for those of you who aren't very good at geography, Rome is a city. It's currently the capital city of Italy. We know the legs of iron are represented in Rome because other areas in Scripture stipulate this. Similar to the last few nations, Rome is also represented in iron because of its strength. Rome was and is remembered because of its strength. And iron is known, obviously, as a very strong metal. This is another way that the image shows what kingdom it's referring to. You may also remember that the next kingdom, or the next part of the image, was not a complete takeover, but more of a mixture of the legs and another material, which was clay. So Rome, or the effect of Rome, never really went away and remains till today in the capacity that we'll look into. So you can see there the succession in both powers and time through Nebuchadnezzar's image. We start in Babylon, then Medo-Persia takes over, and then there's Greece, and then there's Rome. And we can see all that from historical records as well. We move then into the feet area of the image, where the iron of Rome is mixed with miry clay, as Daniel 2 calls it. Now, this kingdom was obviously represented in 2 legs, which is actually representative of the 2 parts of the Roman Empire. There was the Western Roman Empire in Rome, and there was the Eastern Roman Empire, which was based in Constantinople. So there we have the 2 sides to the empire represented in the 2 legs of Nebuchadnezzar's image. Now, after the Roman Empire in the image, the next visualization is the iron being mixed with miry clay, mentioned in verse 41 of Daniel 2. And as we see, Daniel shows Nebuchadnezzar that this shows a division in the 2 parts of the kingdom from then on. Now, as the body naturally continues on, it finishes in toes. There were 10 toes in this image, just like a human, and they all represent something quite important. And to understand all of this and the whole image, we need to move across to another prophecy by Daniel in Daniel 7. Now, we could spend a long time going through all this, and we could go back over the entirety of Nebuchadnezzar's image in comparison with Daniel 7, but we're just going to focus specifically on the part that relates to the Roman part of the image and beyond. So once we get to Daniel 7, we can skip through to verse 7. For context, this record is a divine dream that Daniel received from God, which contains images of different animals and different beasts detailed very specifically, which represented very specific things in history and that have come to pass or will come to pass in the future. Before we get to verse 7, we can see in previous verses, such as verse 4 and verse 5 and verse 6, that speak about a lion and a bear and a leopard. Now, all these animals represented a different kingdom within Nebuchadnezzar's image, and that's the context of where we're working from. And let's read from verse 7 to verse 8. I'll just read that now. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, there's a few indicators in there that you may have noticed from our description of Rome already that are like indicators that this beast is referring to Rome, and we'll go through them and point them out. So firstly, it refers to this as the fourth beast. And this is an obvious one, but the fourth metal in Nebuchadnezzar's image is also Rome. So we know that the fourth metal and the fourth beast both represent Rome. Secondly, as we saw, Rome also was seen as a very strong power, as the phrase "the might of Rome" is used very commonly in history. We also know that the fourth metal was iron. We know that's a strong metal, and it's represented by Rome, which leads into our third giveaway, that is referring to Rome when it talks about the fact that this beast has iron teeth. The metal in Nebuchadnezzar's image that was used to represent Rome was iron, and also Rome was known for using iron extensively in construction of both tools and weapons. So there's 3 things already that show that we're dealing with Rome represented in this beast. Another characteristic is that this beast destroyed the previous beast, but didn't just destroy it, fully and brutally destroyed it. And this verse talks about how it stamped the residue, or stamped on the remains of the previous beast. This is symbolizing the brutal way that Rome was known for defeating its enemies. It wasn't just a move in and defeat the enemy sort of situation. They were known for mercilessly destroying every single part of whoever it was they were attacking. And you can go through history and look at stories of them doing that if you'd like. There's plenty of examples. Now the verse also goes on to say how that this beast was very different or diverse from beasts that had come before it. And we can see a stark difference in the fact that this was the first beast that Daniel didn't actually liken to a real animal. So the first animal was a lion, then the second was a bear, then the third was a leopard, but this one just referred to it as a beast. It was unlike anything he'd seen before in the dream. And another reason it was unlike other beasts in a literal sense is that Rome used very different military tactics and methods to that of previous powers. They were brutal in their defeat of enemies, and so it was very reasonable that Daniel could describe it as very different to past beasts. So we know that this beast, which is the fourth beast of Daniel 7, is referring to Rome. This is what this prophecy uses to represent Rome, and everything coming from it, as we see, is seen as part of Rome, or a development of Rome. So after the description of Rome as the beast in these verses, we can see that Daniel tells us the beast has 10 horns. Now there's no animals in the current animal kingdom that I'm aware of that can be distinguishable by 10 notable horns, so we can conclude that what Daniel meant by this beast not being like anything he'd seen previously is that he couldn't liken it to any other animal in the animal kingdom. It was unique and it was unnatural. Now we don't want to get into too many details about the beast of Daniel because that would take a long time, but I just wanted to show how that Rome was described as an unnatural or a unique beast. As you can see in the rest of that quote on the screen there was one horn that sprouted up on the head of the beast amongst all the other horns, and this one was very different as it had the eyes of a man and it was speaking great things. Now history tells us that the Roman Empire during its reign morphed into a religious nation, so you can be confident in saying that this prominent figure is referring to a prominent religious figure or the Pope. The Pope was and is represented in this horn as part of the fourth beast, and it speaketh great things, as Daniel 7 says. The Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church, which, as we know, has quite a global reach, even today. We saw right at the start of our lecture tonight how that the Roman Catholic Church has basically set up a country within Rome that they use as their home. And like we said, it's called the Vatican. That's the centre of the Catholic Church, which is represented in the iron of Nebuchadnezzar's image. So our topic for tonight was Italy, and from a cursory glance and a brief search, as we saw, Italy doesn't appear to have a lot to do with the Bible. But once we look a little bit deeper, we can actually see that it definitely does. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church is one of the most problematic and abominable things in God's eyes. So there's actually quite a huge focus on it in the Bible and how that Christ is going to return to remove that form of false worship that has been set up. And we'll get into that toward the end, because that's also spoken of in Nebuchadnezzar's image and the interpretation of it. Before we have a look at that last part of the dream he had and what the stone cut out of the mountain refers to, I just want to move into something we'd said we'd have a look at a bit earlier. So obviously the Roman Catholic Church professes themselves to be Christians. They profess to follow God and everything to do with him. However, Christianity today, practiced by the Roman Catholic Church, and Christianity back in the first century are actually very different. It's different because of the Roman Empire and the historical events relating to it. And I just want to have a quick look into that and go over some history to show how that the Romans and the Roman Catholic Church has been made from and has changed religion for us today, or for themselves today. And like we said, there were two legs or two sides of the Roman Empire. There was the western side, which is Rome, and there was the eastern side, which as we saw was Constantinople. The capital city in the Eastern Roman Empire was called Constantinople, and it was named this because the ruler, which was Constantine, decided that would be the capital, and he named it after himself. So just a bit of context to this story and how this all works out. So quite soon after Christ's death and his resurrection, there were many believers that started falling away to another religion or another false religion. They still called it Christianity, but it was mixed with other beliefs. Things got bad for actual believers at the time because they were excommunicated and overwhelmed by these who falsely called themselves Christian. By the 2nd century AD, they had started to flee because of risk of persecution. They were being persecuted because by the Romans, because the Caesar at the time was claiming his own exclusive sovereignty, or himself as the one to be worshipped. Now this then meant that Christians who followed Christ and not Caesar, in the Romans' eyes, needed to be eradicated to uphold and maintain the Caesar's, and indeed the entire Roman Empire's sovereignty. Now this was the setting in which the doctrine of the Trinity, or false worship, emerged, which is the main doctrine that differentiates Catholics from real Christians. Now, in the few decades after Christ's death, questions started arising during this period concerning Christ's exact nature. They were saying, was he man? Was he God? Was he God appearing as a man? Was he a man who became God? Was he created by God the Father, or did he exist eternally with the Father? The beliefs of the original followers of Christ were lost, and new beliefs, many of them coming from pagan religions, replaced the teachings of Christ and his apostles. They were all wrong, but they were still arguing about what they thought was right. Now, this constant arguing and disagreement made the situation in Rome quite tense, which led the Roman emperor at the time, who we saw was Constantine, to have to make decisive action. Obviously, he wanted to keep control, so he had to find a way to keep the people's respect. He didn't actually care about the argument itself, he just wanted to keep the position as emperor. So he condoned Christianity as the nation's new religion, but still, to stop all the arguing, he was advised by a Spanish bishop by the name of Hosius that to restore harmony, it would be wise to bring representatives from both sides of Christianity to find a doctrine they agreed on. Now, Constantine started the Council of Nicaea, which was basically a group of priests and important religious people coming together to try and agree on what the correct doctrine would be for this religion. Now, this was the groundwork of the new religion that would come from the Roman Empire or the Catholic Church. After a long period of disagreement and discussion, the Council of Constantinople adopted a statement to finally end all argument over God and who he was and what the correct religion should be based on, which was called the Nicene Creed. Essentially, it was the basis for the Trinity, or the basis for God being considered as a three-part being. It was now the accepted belief for all Christians. This is what you believed if you were a Christian. All churches had to teach and believe this doctrine. They had to assume the title of Catholic Christians, and anyone who believed anything different would, quote, be branded with the ignominious name of heretics. They would suffer in the first place the chastisement of divine condemnation, and the second, the punishment which our authority, in accordance with the will of heaven, shall decide to inflict. That was what they said would happen if you don't believe what they say. So a teaching that was foreign to Christ, never taught by any of the apostles, and unknown to any biblical writers, was then locked in place as the true belief about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This was how the Roman Empire drastically changed religion and how it was viewed. It now only had remnants of true belief, and it was very loosely based on actual truth, but more based on a warped version of the truth in the middle ground to make everyone happy. This is the basis of how the Roman Catholic Church was set up. From the ground up, it's made from false teachings. The whole point of Christianity is the worship of God, and nothing about the Roman Catholic Church is glorifying to God as it's based on false worship. And again, we don't want to get too far into the intricacies of it, but this is also represented in Revelation 17, where it portrays the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope as a harlot. Now, a harlot is obviously an unfaithful person, and we can see this portrayed from verse 3 of Revelation 17, where it talks about a woman sitting upon a scarlet-covered beast, full of names and blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And it goes on to say, And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. This is obviously in reference to the Christians in the Roman time that were persecuted and killed for believing things other than what the Romans wanted them to believe. As we can see, the woman is said to be full of blasphemy, abominations, and fornication, and she is considered the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. And these are very strong words and only really used in this much detail in reference to the Catholic system when talked about in the Bible. We know from this chapter that the woman was riding a beast with 7 heads. And in future verses of Revelation 17, in verse 9, we can see that those 7 heads represent 7 mountains. Now, if you're not familiar with Rome, it's very common knowledge that Rome sits on 7 hills, as you can see on the screen there. There's a lot of things we've worked through tonight that have shown how related Italy actually is to the Bible, which we now know is a lot. There's a lot of things in the Bible that relate to Italy. We couldn't get through it all in one night, but I thought looking through the things we've looked at tonight could create a good understanding of the Bible's point of view on Italy and Rome in general. Now, it's a beautiful country, as we saw, but the history and the religious stronghold it has is an abomination to God and will eventually come to an end. Now, like we said, there's one more part of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that we want to consider tonight, and that's the stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands. If you remember, the stone was cut out of the mountain and smashed the statue of Nebuchadnezzar to pieces and ground it to powder, eventually then going on to fill the whole earth. Now, that stone, or that rock, represents the Lord Jesus Christ. In the future, he is going to come and destroy the final world power of Nebuchadnezzar's image. The Roman Catholic Church will exist up until he returns to deal with it, and it's then that he will figuratively grind it to powder and remove it from existence, as it's such an abomination to God, as we saw in Revelation. After that, the stone grows to fill the whole earth, as Daniel prophesied. This is representative of God's eventual plan with the earth. If we turn to Habakkuk 2 verse 14, we can see the purpose of the earth, and that's represented in that stone. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the purpose of God, and that's what's going to happen once the rock cut out of the mountain has finished destroying the kingdoms of the earth set up by men, as we saw in the image. The whole reason the earth existed was to be filled with the glory of God, and that's represented in Nebuchadnezzar's image all the way back in Daniel by this stone filling the earth after it destroys all of the world powers. So in conclusion, I hope you can see what we've looked at tonight, that it's important to have an understanding of Italy and Rome's involvement with the Bible, and how it is a key part in understanding God's plan with the earth and why he's going to destroy all these world powers and everything they've set up. Just one quote I wanted to end on was from the chapter we read tonight, from Daniel 2 verse 44, which shows God's nation in comparison to the nations of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Thank you.